Hi, everybody. Please ignore any dead air you might have seen. We got a lot of people coming in for the next one, so we had to do a little shuffling around. But thank you guys so much for sticking with us. Thank you to Maricela, Chris, Sheila, and Sharon for that amazing discussion. It has been such an amazing day. At Ellevate, we understand the importance of building cultures that engage employees, give them purpose, build trust, and encourage them to stay and grow with the company. That's why we work with our partners to be there as a safe space for their employees to meet others, get diverse perspectives, and continue to grow their careers. If you'd like to learn more about our work with companies, you can reach out to Allison, who leads our enterprise team. She's going to drop her email in the chat for you. Before we start our final session, I can't believe we're already here. We'd love to once again thank our sponsors for their support. Those are Accenture, Alliant Insurance Services, American Bankers Association, Bungie, Diageo, FactSet, IPC Systems, Kinship, Lincoln Financial Group, Lanik, Mars Pet Nutrition, Mars Veterinary Health, Mutual of Omaha, New York Life, NFP, Planned Parenthood, Penny Finance, Plus Media Solutions, RBC Wealth Management US, Royal Canin, Thornburg Investment Management, and Verizon. We could not do this without you. And a huge thank you to all who have gone through this ride with us, whether you were here since the beginning of the day or you just tuned in. No matter what, it has been an honor to be your guide throughout the day. And finally, introducing our last segment, it is very special. As always, we pride ourselves in building these conversations in a way that showcase different ideas and perspectives, and this one is by far definitely not the exception. It is important now more than ever to use our voice to shape the world we want to live in, and the people on this section do it exceptionally. So please welcome to the stage Fatima Goss, President and CEO of the National Women's Law Center and co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, Dr. Nicole Mason, President and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, Stacey Sofrodini, CEO and National Campaign Director of Freedom for All Americans, Kai Shapley, youth activist, and Christine Schiffner, bureau chief at the National Law Journal of Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to see you all. We have such an amazing group of panelists for this last panel. I'm very excited, and I will start with a brief introduction. I will have to read it because all you guys have such great credentials. It's impossible to memorize it all. So I will start with Kai. She is the youngest of all panelists, obviously, but she's already a star. Kai Shapley is an accomplished young actress, author, public speaker, and activist, currently in 5th grade. Kai loves her family, her friends, her chickens, her dog, her cat, of course, everything Dolly Parton. She has a variety of aspirations for the future, ranging from owning more cats than her mother currently allows to being elected president in 2048 or any other future year. Now, Kai is transgender and has been under attack from the Texas Legislator since she was in kindergarten. Her testimonies before the Legislative Committee, considering legislative ideas designed to bully transgender kids, have repeatedly gone viral, have been all over the internet. She has also won numerous awards, including being a finalist for Time Magazine's Kid of the Year in 2021. Moving on to Casey Sofrodini, he is a national recognized campaign strategist, an expert in LGBTQ issues advocacy. In his current role as CEO and national campaign director at Freedom for All Americans, Casey has been the chief architect of bipartisan campaigns to successfully secure milestone victories for LGBTQ non-discrimination protections and beat back at anti-LGBTQ attacks. These wins include passing the country's first standalone statewide transgender public accommodation law, passing comprehensive statewide transgender non-discrimination protections for the first time in a Republican-controlled state, passing LGBTQ non-discrimination protections for the first time in the South, and winning the first statewide popular vote on transgender rights in U.S. history. Fatima Goss-Graves is a nationally recognized leader in the fight for gender justice and an expert in law, policy, and culture change. She is president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, president of the National Women's Law Center Action Fund, and a co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Fatima has a distinguished track record working across the board a broad set of issues central to the lives of women and girls. She is widely sought after for her effectiveness in the complex public policy arena at both the state and federal levels, and regularly testifies before Congress and federal agencies. And last but not least, Dr. Nicole Mason was recently named one of the world's 50 greatest leaders by Fortune magazine. She's the president and chief executive officer of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. For the past 2 decades, Dr. Mason has spearheaded research on issues related to poverty, women's issues, and entitlement reforms, policy formation, and political participation among women, communities of color, and racial equity. So this is going to be a great discussion. I'm really looking forward to this. And I mean, just to set the stage and to kick it off, I mean, more than 20 states are currently working to enact laws targeting transgender youth and LGBTQ community. We're seeing a conservative push transform the legal landscape, not only in this space, but of course also in the constant context of the discussion about abortion rights. According to the Guttmacher Institute, which tracks abortion issues around the United States, 25 states will ban or at least partially ban abortion as soon as, or if Roe v. Wade is overturned, as suggested by the recent Supreme Court leaks. So, which of course would also primarily, or for a big part, affect Black, Indigenous, and women and people of color. So I wanted to ask you and throw the ball around the group. What are the changes and the challenges you're seeing and we should pay attention to in this context? Fatima, maybe you would like to start?
Yeah, we're in a time that is, I know, deeply worrying to so many people, including those who are listening to this conversation today. And the first thing I just want to name, and I appreciate that you have framed these issues together, and I actually think it would be a mistake to see the assault on abortion access and the assault on trans rights and the assault on or the efforts to ban books and the sort of tropes around critical race theory as sort of separate attacks, when they are all a part of a single story, in my view, one that is anti-rights and one that is designed to control the sort of lives and futures of a whole lot of people in a way that feels to many of us sort of off-putting and disorienting, in part because the majority of people aren't asking for that agenda, and yet it's racing forward. And so I think people need to understand that this is deeply connected. And as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about not only the long arc of our justice, the long arc and durability of our Constitution, it's also a very worrying time from that perspective. And so I don't want to end even this answer on just a down note, but I think that context and understanding deeply what we're up against is so very important in designing and understanding, okay, what is it that we can do as everyday folks, and what is it that we're going to call on the institutions that have a lot of power in this country to make a difference in people's lives to do.
Yeah, I'm not trying to, be all. We will obviously also move on later to some achievements that have been made. And I mean, the polls say one thing, the public opinion polls related to transgender rights or LGBTQ plus rights, and the legislative realities in parts of the country tell a different story. There's just such a disconnect there, it seems. So, Nicole, how are you seeing this equation, and where do you see the challenges as you within your work, your day-to-day work?
So I see it in quite the same way that Fatima does, and I think it's really important that we have a strong intersectional analysis when we're thinking about all these things. and all the attacks on both women's rights, LGBTQ rights, the stuff happening in the schools and the shootings, like all of these things are very connected and very concerted efforts to strip away individual rights and liberties, but also to instill fear and terrorize groups and individuals because of who they are. When I think about the attack on women's rights related to abortion, it's not just about, it is about rights, but it's also about the economics and the cost of these pieces of legislation. For example, when we think about abortion, states right now, abortion restrictions and state laws have costed local economies and workers $105 billion annually. And the stripping away of protections for LGBTQ and transgender individuals also has an economic cost. So really, I'm thinking about the individual rights and liberties and the laws and legislation that is being rushed through and passed at both the federal and state levels, but also the economic cost to families and communities when these pieces of legislation are enacted is really critically important in this moment.
And Casey, you have also, you have worked in a political campaign on political campaigns before. I mean, the Biden administration now obviously has one agenda, and it's a very progressive agenda. But then around the states in the country, we're seeing, and also at the Supreme Court level, we're seeing a different story. How do you see the current climate? Where are we heading, and what should we pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Fatima and Nicole have said already. It's kind of dark humor, but I often say that our opponents are almost better at intersectionality than we are at this point, and we really need to up our game if we want to get out in front of them. It's not a secret to anybody here that we're living in an incredibly partisan time. This may be with us forever. We don't know, exactly where we're headed, but, we at Freedom for All Americans have really focused on the bipartisan work, have really focused on trying to win over Republicans precisely for that reason, right? It's not a mystery that, especially with respect to LGBTQ issues, that Democrats are a bit more supportive than Republicans are. But the reality is that, we need to win over Republicans too, if we want to make progress in this moment and into the future. 2/3 of states are Republican-led or controlled. The federal courts are shifting to the right. Congress, I think, is probably likely to stay closely divided, no matter who's in control for many Congresses to come, the way our political system is working. And of course, there's increasing partisanship among the public. And so the question for us is sort of, how do you move things forward, and how do you have the hard conversations that we need to have when we're increasingly having trouble bridging difference? And so what we have really been focusing on is really just trying to do the work of demonstrating that LGBTQ issues, all the issues we're going to be talking about here, are about people. They're not about politics. We've got to find ways to sort of transcend the divides, get out of the tribalism, and make progress. And we also want to make sure that the progress we make is durable, so our families aren't, political footballs going back and forth depending on which party is control for generations to come. It's not the kind of country I think any of us want to live in, not just those of us here, but I think folks all over this country. And we have, specifically done this primarily through concerted efforts to, reach conservative lawmakers and ensure they have opportunities to meet and get to know LGBTQ people, especially transgender people. And we've seen opportunities like that, even in this complicated climate, result in really transformative change. We've seen GOP lawmakers who have voted against us come out, flip their positions and start advocating for us. We have seen governors who've campaigned against us to get into office flip and actually sign our bills into law. We've won ballot measures in conservative cities, working directly with the conservative public to try to move them. I think it takes time, but we know it's working because you know, as you said, we've been able to pass LGBTQ protections in Republican-controlled states. We've been able to get multiple Republican governors to, you know, change their positions to vote against some of these awful bills that we've seen in this year. So, you know, we're going through a really rough moment right now, I think, on all the issues that we care about and all the issues that impact us. But my hope is that, you know, generally speaking, from all of the research, all of the experience that I've had, is that, you know, people from all walks of life are generally with us. You know, people want to see themselves as fair-minded, and the work that we need to do is to make sure that on the issues and the people that they're not familiar with, that makes them vulnerable to these opposition arguments, whether it's around schools or around abortion or around transgender rights, that we're able to familiarize them with those issues better so that they aren't vulnerable to those arguments, and so that they stay on our side.
And you said, you know, it is about people, and it really is, and Kai can really attest to that. I mean, you have been in the state legislator making your case. It was a very impressive video to watch on the internet, and if you could give us a little bit, tell us a little bit about that. How did you end up at the Texas State Legislator, and just, you know, tell us a little bit about that day.
Well, I originally wasn't intending on going, but our friend Chase insisted that we went, so we did, because, I mean, it was the right thing to do. And, I mean, it made me really angry hearing what some of the people said and how some of the senators acted. Like, while some other people were talking, they would just sit and play on their phones. And it was very infuriating. And when I was the first trans kid to go up there, and that whole thing was all about trans kids. I was the first trans kid they saw, and they had no questions. They had absolutely no questions. And I thought that was upsetting, because they want to attack us, and I'm the first trans person they've seen, and they don't even have any questions.
And I mean, it is very upsetting, and I think that also really describes the problem so well for so many people, because they don't have any questions and they don't want to ask any questions. That's where it all starts. So, I mean, what did you tell them? How did you? I mean, you really went up there and took a stand. So, I mean, what did you tell them?
Well, I told them what I should have told them. I told them that we're human too, and we should be able to live our lives without being under attack and having to hide.
I mean, are we currently really seeing an increase in these sort of conservative efforts to pass anti-LGBTQ transgender legislation, or are we just more aware because there is more written about these issues now? I mean, could you just, you know, give me maybe Fatima or Nicole, or, you know, whoever would like to start first, give us a little bit of a historic overview. You know, if it's, I mean, this really appears to be a concerted effort from the conservative side, but, you know, where are we at?
We are for sure in a dramatic backlash moment where there has been an escalation, not only in the number of bills that have been introduced and passed, but the cruelty of these bills. So it is a thing that I would say comes in waves, but we are actually in a moment that it might feel like it's everywhere, because you're seeing bills introduced in so many places, and in some cases passing. And I will say that you know, I'm so interested in what Casey thinks, but that sort of concerted copycat escalation, it is actually very similar to what we are facing on these other issues. So rather than focusing on ensuring at the state level that pandemic dollars are going to the right places, or investing in care infrastructure, or raising wages for people, or supporting schools as they return from virtual to in person. There was an on-purpose agenda to focus on attacking trans youth, to focus on CRT, and to ban abortion. And so talk about focus on the wrong things, but there could have been a very different agenda. So it seems like it's everywhere because, in my view, of the escalation.
I completely agree with that. I think too, big picture, some of what we're seeing this particular year is, I think, a conflation of dedicated opposition who is always organizing like this and always trying to do, these sort of nationwide coordinated legislative attacks. But it's conflated this year with an election year where this year the GOP happens to think that this is a good, some in the GOP at least happen to think that this is a good election year strategy. It's not the first time we've seen it on any of these issues. Certainly in the LGBTQ space, it's not. I mean, many of us remember 2004, and there were 13 anti-marriage ballot measures on the ballot in states across the country on one election day. These are all states that didn't have marriage yet, and yet they were going to vote on whether or not to have marriage because it was, it was a huge, scary thing that people needed to get involved in, and that was the Karl Rove strategy to get Republicans elected then too. So we see this from time to time. But Fatima's, absolutely right. That this year, in terms of the volume, around transgender issues, it is remarkably different than what we've seen any time in recent history, and that many of us can actually recall. There's been over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills overall filed this session. About 25 of them have passed already. I think something like 118 of them are specifically, against transgender people. We've just never seen numbers like that before. I mean, frankly, a couple of years ago, lots of people didn't know we existed. So to see numbers like this so quickly is, we obviously have their attention. I think part of the reason it's happening too is because there's been a lot of work on LGBTQ issues over the decades. There's, we won marriage equality. There's still a lot of support for marriage equality, and through that work, Americans have become much more familiar with gay and lesbian people, but they are not as familiar with transgender people. And so our opponents are really fixated on us, even though we are not new. They are very fixated on us because, as I was saying before, we're a population that the public is not familiar with. They are vulnerable to the lies and stereotypes that are perpetuated against us. And that's what a lot of these bills are. And completely agree with Fatima, the cruelty of these bills is also truly, truly shocking and different than we've seen in future years. And it's not just bills. There's also extrajudicial actions like, Governor Greg Abbott in Texas, directing the Department of Child and Protective Services to investigate, parents who support their trans kids as child abusers. I mean, this is the state that Kai lives in, right? So, our families are really going through a very scary time. It's a very big crisis. I have hope that we will get to the other side because of the courage of people like Kai, the willingness to come forward and be known and let people get to know them. But this year is really, really different. And the reason for that is this conflation of politics, dedicated opposition, and lack of familiarity with transgender people, and our movement being really vulnerable on that piece.
And Kai, you are indeed very brave. I mean, what are you encountering if you go out in the community? When you go out in the community, what kind of opposition do you meet? What are you encountering from people? Can you describe a little bit?
Well, luckily, because my mom wants me to have a childhood, we've been moving to safe places. So we haven't had much, but back in Houston, our old home, people used to yell at my mother at the grocery store, and they would spit on her and say that the devil has taken hold of her and her child.
Yeah, I mean, you have also worked on documentaries, right? You have been in an award-winning documentary film to shed light on these issues, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes, I have, and I'm glad that people are realizing that they need to use their gifts to help us. And the people who I filmed with, they're like my family. I chose them and they chose me. Darisha, if you're watching this or if you ever see this, I just want you to know I love you and thank you for supporting us. Thank you for telling our story.
Important story to tell, absolutely. And at the same time, I think Casey also mentioned that our previously in our prep talk yesterday. They have the public opinion polls tell a vastly different story on these issues. There has been, I think, 80% or so of Americans favor to protect LGBTQ plus legislation, or discriminate, are against discrimination of these groups. But at the same time, there is this concerted effort from the right. So, what movements have you, what actions have you seen on the positive side of the spectrum? Maybe we could go through the whole round again, starting with Casey. I don't want to have this be like all sad and dreary in this discussion. So, there have been some positive signs too here and there. So, Casey, maybe you could start and give a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, sure. Support for non-discrimination protections, as baseline protections for LGBTQ people, which I read as a proxy for just generally support for LGBTQ people, is kind of at an all-time high. It is higher actually than it is even for support for marriage equality. It's at 83% nationally, which is up 12% over just the last 7 years. And within that, 65% of Republicans nationally are supportive of protections, and that actually includes majorities in all states across all political parties. So there is, and I think it was Fatima that made this point earlier, there is a discrepancy between what we're seeing our lawmakers do and where the public is, and the problems that they're responding to and the problems that the public is actually having and that the public wants them to respond to. And I think some of this growth in some ways has of course come from work on marriage equality and other other conversations in the national media that have been happening. And of course, there's always a silver lining. I think even with the really, really terrible stuff that's happening, it has engendered a lot of conversation about transgender people, which is probably moving the ball forward with us, with people who are more inclined to be fair-minded. But I think there's been other elements that have helped us, with the public as well. So, we're seeing, more and more LGBTQ people on TV and in the movies who, their storyline is not about being gay or trans, right? They just happen to be, and they have storylines like they're normal people, like everybody else, who have full lives and full interests, and being a queer person just happens to be one part of who they are. In terms of movement work, we've worked very intentionally, particularly around the transgender issue, to organize, businesses, labor unions, progressives, conservatives, faith leaders, advocates for women, medical associations, athletic, everything that we can marshal to really demonstrate something that is already true, but that people might not quite know, which is that America is really ready to see their friends and family members and neighbors who happen to be LGBTQ treated with dignity and respect. And we've seen that, elevating that support and kind of bringing those strange bedfellows together again and again has really helped both with lawmakers and with the public in helping people get over some of the controversies that our opposition raises, and kind of getting them back to a place of realizing, like, these are normal people. I don't have to understand everything about them to support them.
And thank you, Casey. And Nicole, you have just recently also hosted a Power Plus summit, and where you discussed some of these issues and also pushed for more gender parity. Can you describe a little bit what you're trying to push and achieve, and where you see if there is any light at the end of the tunnel, like what, in what avenues?
So one of the things I've been thinking about is how we start the conversation in a different place. And I also want to be honest about a few things. So there's a lot of attacks happening on a lot of fronts, or LGBTQ, women's rights, workers. Like there's a lot of concerted attacks. What I'm most concerned about is what I feel to be, and I love the movements that I work in, but it seems like a lack of strategy and how to really think about these attacks in a real way and mobilize across communities to push them back. And so that is what's been most concerning, because I do believe that while these attacks ebb and flow, many of the attacks on people's rights are historic and have continued, over time. And, in this moment, I think 2016 was a flashpoint where we saw a lot of people feel emboldened to lean into hate and fear, and they saw an opportunity from the top to be able to mobilize in states and in their communities around hate, basically. And so where I am, and I think what we are hoping and trying to do, and thinking about the recent attacks, is thinking about how we might strategize, not only to push back but also put forth ideas that might protect individual rights and liberties and communities and those who are most vulnerable. And I'm not sure that we have that roadmap or that, collectively that I think I'm hoping that we get to a place. This moment feels very urgent, very, very urgent to me. And so just briefly about the summit, we really were hoping to start the conversation in a different place, talking about a range of issues focused on gender equality, but also trying to articulate a vision for ourselves and our communities and our work, to move the needle on many of these issues. So I think we need a defensive strategy, but also an offensive strategy, and put forth, really powerful vision, because the people are with us. The public opinion bears out that, we have more support than not. But I can tell you, in this moment, it doesn't feel like it.
And I mean, we are in a hyper-partisan climate at the moment right now, and it is an election year. So, I mean, how should we strategize in this moment where, obviously emotions run high and certain groups are easily targeted? Fatima, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the one thing I want to disagree with my friend Nicole on is I actually think that, and this is something about progressive folks generally, they often discount our strategy, and we give a lot of credit to the right for its strategy, where I've been doing a lot of thinking about, plans that they put in the works many decades ago are really finding their light and their prime, but they lost a whole lot along the way. And I know that and remember that because sometimes I won in the midst of these really tough debates. And what I would say is that we're in sort of a new generational pivot for our times. And we have two tasks. We have as Nicole said, we have a short-term task that's really about, in my view, protecting as many people as possible and helping them protect themselves. And that is because the policies are literally putting people's lives and bodies in deep harm's way. But we also have what I will describe as maybe a gift, and it probably is not going to feel that way, but just bear with me. We have the gift of being on the front end of a long arc campaign in which we decide we're winning. And that's not going to feel good, but it is also an investment that's not going to pay off overnight. And it's not about one election cycle. It really is about the next decades, about what sort of country we are and what it means to be in this country, and what it means for our lives and futures and our ability to be whole people. And so that isn't a thing that's going to pay off overnight, And as I think about this election, probably folks who are listening feel like every election, somebody is out there saying, this is the most important election of your life. Like that, there is a version of that is often repeated. But I will say it has felt that way these last few elections. And that is because so much of our institutional and foundational frameworks were at stake. And that remains true today. That was like really deeply understood in 2016 around the state of our courts. That was really deeply understood in 2020 around the state of our democracy. And I think people should understand that what felt really fragile just 2 years ago remains so. And that part of the work of being a part of democracy is deciding and understanding that you have a responsibility to engage in it deeply, even when it's hard, even when they disappoint you in an ongoing and repeated way. And so that is a part of our call this time. It feels important, it feels urgent, and it feels that way really at all levels. So people are going to be asked to do things like vote, but they're going to be asked to do much more. They're going to be asked to be real meaningful participants in this democracy, and showing up and calling their leaders to account and engaging with other folks and bringing people along and making sure other folks can participate. That's hard work, but it turns out being a part of a democracy is also hard work.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the good fights, unfortunately, always take a long time to fight through. I have a couple of questions from the audience, but before I go there, I just wanted to ask Kai too, because she is the generation of the future, and when we vote for her generation for a big part. And so what would you want to happen? What would you want to see? What would you want to see?
I would like to see people like me being able to be ourselves without constantly being under attack and being threatened. I want to be able to see kids being happy that they can be themselves. I want to see people expressing who they really are without being afraid. That's why we need people to vote.
I have a question from the audience here. What's the best way to get involved in this fight? Protests, petitions, speaking out? Maybe I'll start with Casey again. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in. I would actually love to hear what everybody has to say. I think this one is interesting. It's obviously a very crowded environment right now. I have some sort of just, very concrete, discrete recommendations, which is, I would just recommend that people, get on or make sure that they're on the lists of the organizations who lead the work that they care the most about, and read those emails. I know we send you a lot of them, but please read them, mostly to say, don't settle for the information that's coming at you. I think we all know you can't necessarily trust what's coming at you. Go out and get the information you're looking for from sources that we know you can trust. And, I think precisely because there's so much going on and it's hard to follow, this is my second recommendation, which is it is really, really important in this moment to be talking with friends and family about what matters to you and where you're directing your votes and where you're directing your resources and your time. I think this is a way for us to really multiply our impact by ensuring that people are informed, ensuring that people are showing up to vote. I mean, it's kind of back to basics here, folks, right? When you read an email or an article about something that matters to you, make a concrete commitment, tell 3 friends about it. When you vote, make a plan to remind 3 friends. Like if we all did that, right? If we all did that and stuck to it, our reach would be so vast. And I to both Nicole's and Fatima's comments, I mean, there's so much that they both said that I want to react to, but it's so really true. I think this is a moment where there is a lot of familiarity there. We have talked about how there is, what's happening in the LGBT space. The volume is new. The cruelty of the attacks is new. But there is a lot, like Nicole said, there is a lot that is old. We are seeing the same kinds of attacks we've seen since the 1970s, calling us groomers, all that kind of stuff. That is old playbook material. But I've also been part of efforts where I've seen, I'll give a really quick example. I was on the ground in Massachusetts when we were defending some transgender non-discrimination protections at the ballot in a statewide vote in 2018. And the first day of early voting was the day, if people recall, that then President Trump, pronounced that he was going to legally erase transgender people from federal law. Horrible day for transgender people, very terrifying. And we were freaked out. We didn't know how this was going to play. Was this going to embolden people to vote against us, give them permission, et cetera, et cetera. But the opposite happened. Like, we got flooded with volunteers, so many volunteers that we didn't have the capacity to manage it. I was out door knocking, and I met somebody who was also door knocking who said she had never engaged in a political issue ever in her life. But she got off the couch for this, not a trans person, just got off the couch because she just could not stand to watch the punching down that was happening. I think that's the moment we could be in right now, where we have this sleeping giant, awakening, where people, most people who do not want to see these kinds of divisions want to see an end to it. But our job, I think, is to make sure that we are providing guidance to those people. So that would be my recommendation to folks, would be to be informed and to be talking to people and getting them engaged in the process. And whether it's petitions, protests, it doesn't matter. Just get in and get involved, and make sure that you're acting on good information and that you're spreading the word.
Thank you. And Nicole, what's your take?
So I do think we need swift action. And, I agree that there's a long-term strategy, but we need some immediate remedies and solutions. And while I think voting is effective, voting across the states because of redistricting and a lot of voter suppression is not as effective as it could be or should be in terms of creating the kind of change we need to see at the federal and state level. I also think there's an opportunity for narrative change. And so the films, the documentaries, the public opinion polls, the interviews, all those things help to shift the tide and insert a new narrative, counter narrative to some of the narratives that we are, have been hearing. From when I'm talking about this, I often say that there's many ways to be involved and engaged in this work. So if your thing is voting rights, show up to the polls. If your thing is narrative change and creating and storytelling, do that. If your way is going out and showing up at a march or a rally in numbers or going to Congress, do that. I think we need everyone with all their skills and talents and gifts to be engaged in this moment. To Fatima's point, it seems like we're on our heels right now, but thinking about what is the hope? Where is it, being able to articulate for people where it is we want to be and will end up at the end of this, I think is also really important because, even for me, and I think for many of us who've been doing this work for a long time, we need to be able to see that and envision it and envision the possibility of a different.
Absolutely. And thank you. And Fatima, your thoughts?
Well, they all had very wise words. So the only other thing, I'll add two things. One is that you don't have to do just one thing. When I was looking at the way the question was framed about what is the best way, because there's not one best way, some of it is like, what's your time, capacity, and talent? Get to work. So if you can protest, do petitions, speak out, and the list of things Nicole and Casey named, that sounds right to me. I think this is a time, and this is my second point, where people are called to do more than they thought they would. And that's okay. And I think we all need to be feeling that in sort of our hearts and in our bodies, like that we can and must do more. And so that means that doing nothing or taking sort of neutrality positions, that's probably the only thing that I expect is not okay. This is not a sidelines, wait and see how it plays out type of moment. this is actually the moment where you really decide, what sort of country do I want to live in? and where was I when this country had these rich and serious debates about what sort of country that they wanted to be. If you want to be able to tell a different story to that next generation, to Kai's generation and generations beyond, then I think you have to answer that question. And I also would just say Kai is demonstrating that age is not a factor here, right? At 10, demonstrating like courage and ferocity. I'm hoping that others are inspired to do the same. And I'm super honored to be in this conversation with you.
And that also leads very well to the next question from the audience that kind of relates. And it is so easy, is the question, to become overwhelmed by everything going on. How do you maintain hope and motivation in keeping up the good fight? Maybe I'll start with.
Well, my community gives me hope, and I try my best not to worry or get overwhelmed, because it's my mom's job to worry and it's my job to tell my story. I tell my story, my mom worries, because if more people hear me, if more people hear my story, they'll realize that they should help. They should help us. They should let us live our lives as children. Let us play with our friends without being attacked.
Thank you. I mean, I feel so honored to be with all of you in this group. And yeah, I mean, Fatima, any other thoughts on that?
The only other thing I would add to that is I find my hope in the fact I'm just sort of deeply grounded in the history, my own personal family history. I'm the granddaughter of domestic workers. I think about the arc of our long history as people, and it's not always even, it's not always the same. But if you see this as a moment in time, I feel like it is both a privilege and a deep responsibility to be able to be here in this moment doing this work. So we are at a moment, and I'm looking ahead at what do I want things to be like for future generations. So some of it is understanding that we're in a particular moment.
Yeah, Nicole, your thoughts, how to not give up hope.
So I think about this in two ways. So I think about my own personal life. How do I find moments of joy and create joy for myself and for my community and family? And in my home, make sure that it is a place of rest and a place of peace, so that I can be rejuvenated and go back out in the world and do the kind of work that I think is really important, but also can be psychically very draining and violent, just to be honest, in terms of, the kind of vitriol that is directed towards me and the communities that I love in ways that, we're not seen as humans, or, it's very inhumane. And so when I think about hope with a little h, I think about, bringing joy into my life. Sorry, yeah, internet connectivity, virtual world. And then what gives me hope is that, that I know that hate is unsustainable. It is not a winning strategy. No matter who says that it is, dividing people based on who they are, it is not democratic. When I think about democracy, I think about freedom from harm, and the freedom to pursue one's own good in one's own way and have full bodily control and autonomy. That is democracy, and anything else is anti-democratic. And so in a democratic nation, I have to believe that when everything comes out in the wash, we're going to err on the side of democracy. And so that is really also what gives me hope when I think about the larger picture and zoom out.
Casey, what would you add to this, to these points?
Well, it's hard to add to all that, but I will. I'll say a couple of things. One, I think we're right, and that gives me a lot of hope. I mean, I just feel very deeply convicted that we are right, and I agree with everything that everybody else has said. The other piece for me is, it's so hard in this climate, and when you see people shouting at each other, it's just so hard to imagine that people can come together. But I've just seen it so many times, and it is worth fighting for, because every time you experience it, it's like a fresh shower. I mean, when I've been in this movement for 2.5 decades now, despite my boyish good looks, and I spent the majority of it, I'm a transgender man. I spent the majority of my time in the movement, pre-transition. I have not acknowledged that to myself or to others or transition. And, I was out to my family as a queer person, and they were very supportive. But even after having been in the movement for so long, I was really terrified to, acknowledge that I was trans and to tell them. And, I didn't have the courage to call them. I sent them an email so they could digest it and just call me if they wanted to talk. And my brother called me up. He put me on a conference line with my full family. And he said, we don't care what your pronouns are. We don't care what name you use. We love you. And, the only thing I'm bothered by is that you have struggled with this for so long. Like, how did I not know about it? It gets me every time. And it's those kinds of interactions. I've had those kinds of interactions, not just with my family, but, working on the ballot measures, working on the legislation. I mean, there are incredible people out in this country who are just like hungering to help on all of these issues. It's our job, to give them those opportunities. But I am just convinced, we will get where we're trying to get. Our work is about getting there as fast as possible, so as few people are hurt in the process.
And I mean, one factor that may also be on the side of history here is that I think many corporations, tech companies, and others are picking up, and they're looking at this as an issue of fair social governance and corporate governance. So I mean, tech companies have spoken out also in the abortion debate recently, but in other issues as well. Do you see a new momentum coming up with the politics on the one side, but then some corporations in the process of social justice really stepping up?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I think that companies are going to get more and more pressure to be clear where they are on these issues. And some of that pressure will come from their workforce that will want to know where their companies stand, and also what they're going to do to make sure that the people who work for them are okay. So they're getting internal pressure, they're getting consumer pressure, where people are voting with their dollars. And they're getting more broader sort of reputational risk pressure, where it's not enough to just, have the right flag or adopt a hashtag for gender equality, and at the same time say nothing when there are anti-trans laws, when there are bans on abortion. Like we are, that usual PR approach, we have moved past that. And I think we're going to see a little bit of a back and forth over that. You've already seen sort of, the attacks that Disney faced from the legislature, where some politicians are going to preemptively go after companies to try to silence other companies. And I don't think companies will just be able to sit on the sidelines if that's their plans. They will be asked to do more. And I think that is right.
Casey or Nicole, would you like to jump in on that as well?
I don't have much to add. I mean, I think that's spot on. I think that businesses, they are complex enterprises, and I think that their engagement on these issues, I'll just speak to the LGBTQ space where I'm most active. I think their engagement on LGBTQ issues has been incredibly helpful, especially over the last few years, and potentially the but-for cause of some victories in some circumstances. When North Carolina moved to make it illegal for transgender people to use public restrooms, companies were very vocal in pushing back on that. And I think we're a big reason that we saw portions of that law repealed relatively quickly in I think relatively unprecedented ways for how legislatures usually act. But I also agree with Fatima that it's that there's not perfection, and there is increasing pressure for them to evolve and think more about all of the ways that they show up in these spaces, and the ways in which some of the ways they engage might be at cross purposes with each other, and figuring out how to resolve that conflict. And I don't think that's unlike, the points that Nicole was raising either about, our own movements having to look internally and figure out the things that we adjust in this moment. We are in a unique moment. And all of us are looking internally to figure out how do we show up and how do we do our very best work to get where we're all trying to get.
We just have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to make the round. And after we had this really great discussion now, some final thoughts, starting maybe with Kai again. Looking forward, wishes, hopes, final thoughts.
Well, first of all, I'm happy that people are willing to listen and try to change. And thank you all for coming. And to help us, one major way to help us is by using whatever your gift or talent is. If you're a writer, please write. If you're a singer, sing. If you're the president of a PTA, do PTA things. And if your gift is that you know Dolly Parton, tell her to call me.
Yeah, great. Exactly. Casey, final thoughts.
Kai, if you get that call, I hope you'll patch me in. I'll send you my cell. I'll count Fatima in too. I see your hand go up. Just tying it back to some of the legislation that we're seeing, one of the things that is happening, it's happening in the abortion context too. One of the things that's happening in the trans context is that a number of these bills actually go after, not just transgender people, but also all of the people who love them and care for them. They go after their doctors, they go after their parents. And that is a pretty blatant attempt, not only to tell transgender people who we can be, but also to strip away what few supports we have who actually do make it possible for us to live the lives that we were born to lead. So, I think my closing thought would be the perfect antidote to that is to resist that. And if you're someone who supports, transgender people, now is the time to speak up. You don't have to be a parent. You don't have to be a doctor. Just speak up and speak out and push back against this idea that, that we are somehow radical and not already part of the fabric, but also just push back against where our opposition is headed, which is to make it criminal for you to do so. I think we need to really push back on the tide of that before that picks up more steam in other places. And I know it's something we're seeing in the abortion context too. It's clearly an emerging strategy, and we have to work together to push back.
Nicole, your thoughts?
So I just want to start or end where I started about the urgency of this moment. And, I really believe that being really nakedly honest about how severe these attacks are, and if they continue in this way, how much, backlash is one thing. These setbacks that we will see as a result of these bad laws, whether it's LGBTQ or transgender, anti-trans laws or abortion rights, will take more than 50 years to undo and to get us to a better place. So really thinking about how we might turn right now in this moment and come up with some short-term strategies that really get at this head on, I think is really very important. And to really have a very clear intersectional framework and analysis, one that does not tear us apart and pit groups against one another, but understand what our common collective goal and strategy here, and it is freedom for everyone. So, that's what I want to end with.
Fatima?
I was thinking about what Nicole and Casey talked about when we were asked the question around hope and joy and how you cultivate it. And I think we need to end there, because one of the key features and pathways to authoritarianism is a feeling of hopelessness, being convinced that the circumstances upon you are ones you can't fix, and then you stopped acting. And so some of what we're feeling, this feeling is on purpose, and it's by design. And so part of our task right now is doing the hard work to cultivate joy and hope as an act of resistance, and understanding that hope sort of disconnected from action might make you feel not right. But that is why the many things you can do right now are so important. So my call to everyone is to not fall prey to the design that's been built that feels really, really terrible, and understand your own power in this time, that we're going to need it more than we have. So
thank you all so much for taking the time for this amazing discussion. I feel very privileged having you all on this panel, and thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, that had me very emotional. But I just want to say thank you, Fatima, Nicole, Casey, Kai, and Christine, for such a great session. Thank you so much to all of us who joined, or all of you who joined today for Mobilize Women. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Happy, 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 happy Pride to all of you. And I hope to see you again soon. And I'm going to turn it over to Christy Wallace, the CEO of Ellevate Network, to close out the day.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you for being here today. We have had thousands of change makers joining us for these important conversations, and the chat was on fire. So really appreciate that you showed up, that you engaged and were present, that you listened to different perspectives and stories. And when we think about how many people were in this room today, the companies that they represent, the communities they represent, the power that each of us has, we heard so much about that in the last panel, the work we can do. This is a groundswell moment. This is a time for change, and it's a time to create the workplace and the world that works for us. I'm so appreciative to our sponsors for making this accessible to all and for supporting safe spaces for these conversations. Thankful to the Ellevate team, particularly Jess and Maricela and Megan and Sam, who put a lot of work and blood, sweat, and tears into this. To our local community leaders, our chapter leaders, who were just huge champions of today. But most importantly, I'm thankful to all of you, because seeing you show up today, seeing you engage in these conversations gives me hope that we will create change in this world, that we will change the face of business, that we are going to mobilize together, lift one another up, and be that impactful force. Don't let today be the last time you have this conversation. Continue to engage with Ellevate. We have weekly roundtables for executives, for business leaders, for rising leaders, where we continue to have these conversations, as well as conversations on how you better manage your teams. We talked about inclusivity. We've talked about why they stay in culture. We've talked about how we become the leaders we want to be, to really lead through business as a force for good and be that impact and change. Join us for a weekly roundtable. Sign up for a squad. I saw in the chat people saying you need that community of peers. You need that circle to lean on. We have that. Squads applications are opening in just a few days. Become part of this community and get that support you need 365 days a year. And if you are sick of all the virtual stuff, although today was pretty spectacular, our local chapters are doing in-person events at over 30 different cities. So we want to connect with you. We want to keep this momentum going, keep the impact going, change this world, change the workplace, change our lives, ensure that we are all lifted up, we are all moving forward and doing it together. So thankful to all of you, for our sponsors and our team. We've got this. Let's mobilize.